Ever since I started going to university, I've incorporated a new activity into my nightly wind-down routine, reading books. And ever since then, I've read a bunch of books, but up until now, none of them have been Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Overall, to sum up, the book was a gut-wrenching punch into my stomach. Reading through Of Mice and Men gives you a sense of peaceful, calm and tranquility, and at the end takes it all away from you, leaving you despondent and alone, to think of what the book has meant and the reason behind John Steinbeck's work. Before I go any further and tell you what the story is about, I strongly recommend you read the book yourself, or at least watch the movie. Since Of Mice and Men is a masterful story crafted by John Steinbeck that will leave you with a bittersweet sense of nostalgia, joy, and hope. If it is your decision that you would not watch the movie or read the book, here is my best attempt at summarizing what the book is about and the story that is within Of Mice and Men. Of Mice and Men depicts the story and travel, the friendship between a man called Lenny Small and George Milton. If there's anything special about Lenny Small, it would be that he's not very bright. He has a mental disability and only survives thanks to the words and listening to the instructions of his travel companion, George Milton. One thing that redeems Lenny Small is that he is very physically gifted. He's very strong. Jobs like bucking barley and, in the words of George Milton, if you give him a job, he'll do it. The opposite is true for George Milton. He takes care of George every step of the way and is much smarter. He's a very careful man, of small stature, and always goes around with Lenny, telling him stories and hopes about the future. The day where they'll get their own land and live a peaceful life with farm animals and a place they could call home. The story also introduces us to other characters that represent different classes in society that makes you, at the end, unable to help feeling a bit sorry for these people and at least grateful for where you are in life at the moment. At the beginning of the story, we were introduced to Lenny's peculiar liking for petting things that have fur and things that are soft. This was made clear through the words of George. After being banished from their original town of Weed, George and Lenny were going on to find another farm to work on, bucking barley and running errands for the boss. They eventually found where to work from and made a lot of friends. Their life was starting to get better, but in the end, history repeated itself. Lenny Small was banished from Weed and George had to follow because of one thing in particular that he lacked: inhibition. Lenny loved petting soft and furry things like velvet, mice, dogs, and cats. He loved animals, and in particular he had a dream of rabbits on the piece of land that he and George would live and own down the line. This dream, alongside George's, did not come into fruition when once again his habit of loving to pet things led to his downfall. At the new place that Lenny and George were working, we were introduced to the character of Curly. Curly was the son of the boss and a welterweight champion boxer who had a particular dislike and loathing for those who are of bigger stature than himself. We were also introduced to the only female character in the book, his wife. In a fateful day, Curly's wife and Lenny were hanging out, and she offered that he pet her hair. After having learned about Lenny's particular liking for petting soft things. However, this all took a turn for the worse quickly when Lenny got carried away and she screamed. Both of them panicked and Lenny tensed up his hands. And with his strength, in a tussle with a woman as fragile as her, the outcome was clear. Because of this, the whole town began their hunt on Lenny, and at the end, it was George who had to take his life. The book in particular did not have an agenda. It did not want to prove a point, and there were no metaphors within these characters. But because of that, it is the brutal responsibility of the reader to understand and interpret what these stand for, and the book serves to depict the society around which the story unfolds. Throughout their travels, Lenny and George encountered a number of people. We were introduced to Candy, Carly, Carlson, Slim, the boss, and of course, Curly's wife. All of these characters are different depictions of parts of society that I believe are significant. So we'll start with Candy. Candy is an old man who always traveled with his dog. His dog was about as old as it can be, and was starting to live the final years of its life. One night in a bunk bed, with all the workers around, Carlson suggested that they put the dog down. Candy was opposed to the idea of putting his dog out of his misery, since he's had him ever since he was a pup. But in the end, they decided that the dog's suffering should not go on any longer. Candy was also an old man, and shared the same ambitions as George and Lenny. And they were so very close to achieving what nobody seemingly could have, but at the end, fell just short. The story and the character of Candy is a painful one, full of suffering. As a person, at the end of their lives, the older generations, although they had seniority and had the authorities to make the decisions within the group, alone they're just in pain, hurt, and awaiting an inevitable end. Candy understood full well that he was going to follow his dog, but that did not stop him from pursuing his dreams. He was approaching the final years and the last stride of his life, but he never gave up on wanting to have a place of his own. And that's when George and Lenny came along. Crooks in the story was a person of color. Not only that, he also had a busted back. And this, of course, made him the subject of much ridicule. Despite his physical stature and his outgoing, friendly demeanor, Crooks was hated for no reason at all other than his skin color. The workers, however, did not discriminate against Crooks, but particularly Curly and his father, the boss, did not like Crooks very much. Given the time in which the book was written and the years in which it was set, I believe that Crooks was a representation of the prejudice towards people of color as an inferior race and inferior class. He was discriminated against, but in his mind, deep in his heart, he was also just like the other workers. He had a dream like Candy, and he wanted to have companionship like George and Lenny. Crooks never wanted anything more than to have some friends. And he also offered to join in on George and Lenny's dreams for no other reason than to just escape ownership, having a place and an existence that he could call his own. Crooks' dream was the most noble one out of them all. And we end the story of Crooks on a light-hearted note, and he might just escape this servitude. Don't get me wrong, the book did not give any definition for good and evil, but Curly was the closest thing that we ever got to a villain within the book. He was introduced as a small man who, from an inferiority complex, had a particular dislike for those of bigger stature than himself. And Lenny, a big man with a baby's mind as he was the subject of this dislike. Curly was also depicted as a pathetic family man. He was very in love with his wife, But very rarely was this love reciprocated. He was always on edge, expecting his wife to do something, and overcome with jealousy, goes on to assault people, justified or not. What Curly represented, in my mind, was the people of the upper echelons who always feared losing their power and authority. He was the son of the boss, and nobody dared to go against him. But there was one thing that he particularly feared, things that were outside of his control, things that he felt that if he lost it, there would be nothing else left to him at all. You see, Curly had a sufficient life. He was a competent fighter. He had a beautiful wife. His family supported him, and his parents are still alive, willing to give them a piece of their great land. But Curly wasn't satisfied. He wanted more, and he wanted to secure everything that he had with absolute certainty, which we all know cannot be achieved. And that's the cause of Curly's misery. Curly's wife in the story was depicted as someone who all the workers seemed to consider a tramp, a prostitute, if you will, someone who's got the eye and always out looking for men's attention. Although we did not get any explicit explanation of how she did this, we did get a glimpse of it through Curly's absolute anxiety whenever she was outside of the house, going to the bunk beds of the workers, asking where his wife was anxiously because he expects that she might do something wrong. But as the story progressed, we understood more about the character of Curly's wife. She was never given a name, but simply referred to as Curly's wife. She represented the dependence of women on men at this area and time, and how they were perceived within society without getting to understand what lies beneath the surface of Curly's wife. The first person who bothered to listen to her and understand her was Lenny Small, a man who was not much different than a baby. He told her about his dreams, and she told him about what her true feelings were. Turns out Curly's wife was not a disloyal wife, but someone who was forced into a marriage and absolutely detested her husband. Lenny might not have understood this, but he was willing to listen and lend an ear. Maybe that was all Curly's wife had needed. But it's ironic that at the end, she was the cause of his downfall. Finally, George and Lenny. I don't think it would be fair if we considered George alone or Lenny on his own. Because these two, although different, are one and the same, and they represent the same type of people from society. Men. Hard-working, lower-class men who were just out trying to find something for themselves and had a desperate dream of ownership, of freedom, and of independence. People believed that without Lenny, George could have done much better and would have achieved his dreams much faster. But quickly we soon got to learn about Lenny. He was a nice fella. He would never do anything out of meanness. He was very honest, and again, much closer to a baby than he is to a man. This complete contradistinction between George and Lenny made me think about what lies underneath every man in society. Lenny loved hearing the story about how other people, other guys, could not make it to their dream because they were alone. But Lenny loved to emphasize the fact that he had George and George had him, which made them different because they'd have each other's back. And with that companionship and camaraderie, Lenny believed that they would never fall, not to anything in the world. The book ended with George standing over Lenny's dead body after having to kill him himself, which further emphasizes my belief that George and Lenny represented the child and the man inside each of us. The man is George, the person who gets things done, plans things for the future, and always looks towards the better future for both Lenny and himself. But Lenny represented the child within this. He had little inhibition, he would do whatever he wants, and the point of the story, at least to me, was that George having to kill Lenny by himself represented the fact that as we grow up and more things are dumped upon our plate, at some point the Lenny inside all of us would have to go. And it would be up to George to inherit the childlike spirit of Lenny and carry on with the dream that they both shared.